Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for one of our Margins book selling events hosted by The Word, a storytelling sanctuary. The Word is a nonprofit organization working to build inclusive and equitable spaces in the literary arts. To learn more about the work we do, you can check us out at thewordfordiversity.org. My name is Michelle Malonzo, and I'm the Chief Operating Officer here at The Word and your host for tonight. First of all, we just want to thank you to everyone who participated in our Margins Bookselling Month festivities during October. Thank you for the social media posts and messages. Thank you for all that you do throughout the year to make sure our stories reach the communities that need them most. The Margins Bookselling celebration is not over, and we will continue to curate special events and discussions like the one tonight that is specifically for you all throughout the year. I'm honored to be hosting tonight's very special event, Investing in Storytelling, with two extraordinary individuals. Elizabeth Méndez Berry is Vice President and Executive Editor of One World, where she works with authors like Jason Hernandez, Adam Serwer, Ewing, Guadalupe Rosales, and Rashad Robinson. Before joining One World, she invested in the arts, journalism, and freedom of speech in roles at the Ford Foundation and the Nathan Cummings Foundation. She co-founded several philanthropic initiatives, including Critical Minded, which supports cultural critics of color. A critic and journalist, she started her career as an editor at Vibe magazine. In his book Decoded, Jay-Z cited one of her essays as an inspiration for his song Public Service Announcement, and her Spanish language op-ed on street harassment helped spark the country's first ever city council hearing on street harassment. She is on the boards of A Long Walk Home, Scene Journal of Visual Culture, and Critical Minded. She'll be in conversation with Viniyanka Prasad, an advocate for cultural equity and criminal justice, including through her service as founder and executive director of The Word, a storytelling sanctuary, as well as co-chapter head for PEN America's Denver chapter on the Denver Commission for Cultural Affairs, and as a practicing criminal defense attorney, including formerly the chief appellate attorney for the Northern District of Indiana Federal Community Defenders. She is also a close friend and mentor who I love dearly. So let's bring Viniyanka and Elizabeth to the virtual stage. Thank you so much for being here. I'm so excited about this event. It's something that we're all very passionate about. As we were talking earlier, you know, Elizabeth, I've seen you in so many different panels, in conversations we've had at The Word about the power of storytelling and the importance of our stories and to be able to tell them as we intend to tell them is so key. And, you know, I was looking in reading your piece, your little post on Kevin Estrada, and the neon, the eternal glow. I was reading the write-up on the Kennedy Center's Next 50, and you're quoted as saying one of the really important building blocks for social power and economic power and political power is storytelling power. And when I joined The Word, we went over the organization's mission and pillars, one of which is cultural equity. And I'm ashamed to say that it was the first time I had heard the term. We talk about equity, we talk about power, we don't always connect the power of storytelling as well as what is cultural equity specifically. And so I just want to sort of start off there, as this conversation is going to go in many different beautiful directions. But what does cultural equity mean to you?
So, well, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction. Thank you for reading about my friend Kevin, who's the reason that I'm wearing neon. I'm usually wearing more neon than I'm wearing right now, so I apologize for that. My backpack is neon also. What does cultural equity mean? I want to share an example because you're in Arizona, and this is one of the moments in my career where I had kind of those moments of clarity. I was in Arizona in 2010, around the time that SB 1070 passed, the Show Us Your Papers law. And one of the things that I did not know until I was there, it was basically a group of artists and writers went to Arizona, sort of a delegation, a solidarity delegation, to make contact with activists on the ground and also just to better understand what the issues were. And one of the things we learned while we were there was about another bill that was passed about a month later, which was called SB 2281, which was the bill that eliminated ethnic studies in Arizona. And what I've thought about since then is the relationship between political decisions to erase humans and political decisions to erase their stories and how intertwined they are. That experience has stayed with me. And I think it's a testament also to organizers in Arizona that they were unchecked by that. They actually began organizing more effectively in response. And ultimately, in many ways, their organizing in response to both of those bills is part of the reason that Trump lost in 2020. There's a legacy of activation around that. But I think it really behooves all of us to see the relationship between the erasure of people's stories and the erasure of people's lives. Understand that that is essential to the playbook of the historic and the present day playbook of people who are trying to undermine justice and equality, right? And so the question of what is cultural equity, I think for me, is cultural equity is essential to self-determination. And cultural equity is about not just the ability to tell your story or to create your art or to make your music or do your performance art. It's also about infrastructure and resources and power. And so I think about this stuff a lot in the context of the work that I do, and then I'll stop talking. But the world of publishing, there's a whole lot of, people are acquiring proposals by writers of color, for example. But that doesn't necessarily change the balance of power within these publishing houses. And I think it's very, very important when people talk about questions of equity to understand that at the end of the day, the power analysis of who actually is making the calls, who has the opportunity to decide where the budgets go, and all of those things. And I think that's true in all kinds of cultural institutions. Doesn't mean that people can't create important work independently without resources. But when we're talking about equity, we really have to look at how power operates. Thanks.
Oh, all of those things. In a way, I'm going to echo a lot of what Elizabeth said. Again, thank you for hosting us tonight, Michelle, and what a great question to start us off with. Cultural equity, to me, like Elizabeth said, is the fabric of so much more than that. And I do think it's rooted. What cultural equity means to me is access to the freedom and resources to tell your stories in your own way. And I think that both of those pieces are important to, I think Elizabeth did a really great job of talking about the resource side of it. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the freedom side of it, which is that every single one of us deserves to start from the same place of trust with readers and consumers of our stories. Every single one of us should get to build that story the way that's authentic in our own vision. And that isn't actually a freedom that I think that we do all start out with at this point in time. And then I think embedded in that question is really why cultural equity. And as Elizabeth gave one real life example, I'll give another one, which was really the start of my journey into the cultural space from the the penal system. And it is that same truth that I really had to learn. I spent years in courtrooms triaging. That's what I do. At the end of the day, I come into a courtroom and there's very little that I can accomplish there. We're already in the worst place possible. And the reason for that is because everything that came before it already erased the person who I'm trying to help. That story is already gone and lost before we ever get there. And I can't rebuild it in the space of a courtroom. That's not possible. And I think after spending many years in that space, I just knew that while it is imperative that I contribute in that space, because there are human beings who are being pulled through that space and who will be affected by that space. I also want to be contributing in a way that changes that dynamic before we're ever there in the first place. And that is storytelling. That is the power to show who we really are and to have other people hold that for us. I think one of the things that we talk about in terms of how we build cultural equity is to understand that that's what we're doing. That when we are building that for one another, what we're doing is holding space. We're investing in that space where each of us can show up and tell that story. And we're holding space for the truth of that story, instead of setting up certain boxes with certain expectations that everything has to fit within.
So I find invest it's why we call it investing in storytelling, but I think it's such an important word, actually, that carries a lot with it. And I think we tend to think of investing in terms of finances and money and whatnot. And we don't always think about that with storytelling. It's art. It's supposed to be pretty and make you feel good and all these things. And it's creative. But what do you take investment in storytelling to mean? How does investing in storytellers and in stories work as part of cultural equity?
Should I jump in?
Oh, always.
Yeah, I mean, I think so the work that I've done has dealt with all kinds of different art forms, including dance and music and performance and all kinds of stuff, and including journalism and nonfiction, fiction. And now as an editor, my job is kind of to identify particular projects and try and pursue them and see if I can work with the author on them. And I think, I feel like there's a few different ways I could answer this, but I guess one way I've thought about it is that when I worked in philanthropy, to subsidize my very expensive journalism habit for a while. For about 10 years, I was in the philanthropy business of giving away other people's money. And in so doing, at every moment, I worked in spaces where there was incredible organizing getting funded, right? There was like powerful work being done in spaces like the criminal justice space, in spaces like the reproductive justice space. And yet there wasn't, I don't think, generally an understanding of the narratives, which is became a philanthropic buzzword during the years that I worked in that space, and sometimes frustrates me because it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But I think it's useful in the sense that what you just said, Viniyanka, about like once you get into the courtroom, that person's story has actually already been told, right? Whether most of the time they don't have any agency or participation in that process, right? And so the narratives are the big stories that get told about communities, get told about issues, many times don't have a whole lot of relationship to reality, but they define it ultimately because we can't see beyond them because they're so embedded in how we understand things. So my job as somebody who was working, investing in the arts or investing in journalism was to say, the issues that you're interested in are actually underpinned by these narratives or storytelling ideas, and you need to intervene there if you want to transform the outcomes in these other spaces. And I think in some cases, like for example, when I worked for the Ford Foundation as a consultant for several years. And while I was there, we funded an investigative reporting shop in Chicago, which was staffed primarily by Black reporters. And one of the things that happened to one of the Black reporters was that she was the basically victim of predatory lending. But it was at a time when the bigger narrative about lending had not come to include this idea of predatory lending. And so she wound up doing this incredible investigation of countrywide mortgages and found out that they were abusing Black and brown communities in Chicago, and that nobody else was paying attention because of who the victims were, right? So she wound up doing this incredible body of work that led to a huge, I believe it was the Justice Department suit against that particular lender, which I think no longer exists. We didn't spend a whole lot of money investing in that institute. I think it's CIR. Somebody, I don't know if anybody knows, Center for Investigative, no, it wasn't Center for Investigative Reporting. I'm messing it up. I'm gonna remember later. But anyway, it was a great little investigative shop. And what they were able to do simply by listening to their reporters was to tell a story that nobody else was following because the dominant narrative was looking someplace else. And ultimately, the value of that story, the disruptive power of that story was so far beyond the small grant that we gave them. I mentioned that as an example of how I see the ripple effects. Like you invest in Puerto Rico I'm not saying investigative reporting is everything, but just an example. They brought down Rosselló, the investigative reporters, brought down the governor of Puerto Rico, right? I was fortunate enough to be on a team that invested in them. Those stories are reported stories as for instances, but I think ultimately when you think about, I think about it as like an ecosystem. You know, what's the storytelling ecosystem that we need in order to be transformational? To me, part of it is like the reality piece, like what is actually happening right now, right? When it comes to criminal justice, it could be, you know, who's getting arrested, who's getting convicted, like what are the numbers now and what do we need to know about them? And then there's like the collective imaginary. Who's telling those stories? Who has that capacity? And I think part of it also from my perspective, and I see this as an editor, is that where's the magnetism in these stories? Like, how do we tell stories that are not medicinal, but that are magnetic? Because I think at the end of the day, at least my perspective is that, especially because I come out of music, journalism and stuff, people don't tend to want to hang out in like depression all the time, you know? They don't always want to hang out in like the stuff I said earlier about, you know, SB 1070 and SB 2281. We need to know that, but we also need a balanced image of who these communities are that is not strictly depressing. So if I were to say like an investment ecosystem, to me, it's like part of it is about the reality, part of it is about the dream, and part of it is just like the playful delightfulness of being alive in, you know, your skin.
Oh,
I love the idea of magnetism. That's I'm gonna keep that with me. Thank you for that. I'm feeling like maybe I'll just be consistently echoing, but I think we come at it from the same perspective. So I think sort of building on some of that, I think investment also, along those lines is if we think about the why of the investment too, and not just sort of the outcome, but understanding how embedded storytelling is into all of the outcomes in all of the spaces, and understanding that yes, it's part of how individuals, not just there's a whole societal aspect of how this ends up kind of who gets power and who is able to be seen in certain ways, but on the individual level, that same process is happening as well. An individual also needs to have the ability to thrive as a human being. And when we're investing in their health, for example, are we really giving them that opportunity to thrive when what we see as their needs is so limited? But their ability to see themselves, their ability to be seen by other people is such a foundational piece of how any of us will be well in this world. So understanding that what we're doing is investing in storytelling is that power, whether it has that effect in terms of investigative, journalism, having that impact, that direct impact, or whether it has that effect in this very, individual way that will radiate out from that individual and that will serve a whole community who can then take care of each other and build upon that well-being that they have received and can then give back. And I think it's the ways that we also, we kind of invest in our own, it allows us the imagination and the space to be able to invest in ourselves, right? That when we put something into valuing storytelling as a practice for ourselves, that gives us the ability to see more for ourselves in the long run, I think. And so giving ourselves, I think, even whatever it is that we're never told we should have, the time, the resources, the any of those things, we should just be out there producing something that someone else has deemed productive. But to a degree, I think we need to set up a space where we know that we each have a practice too of holding storytelling and making the most of it.
Yeah, I love that. And I would just wanted to add something that occurred to me, which is that I think a lot about the archive, like the archive, be it we're working, my colleague Kierna Mayo is working with an author called Sarita Gates, who's brilliant. And her thing is archiving hip hop journalism and archiving a ton of things. But one of the things that she was interested in is hip hop journalism. And it's just been fascinating to observe. She has a great phrase that I'm going to mangle, but it's something like the act of archiving is an act of valorization or something like that. Like the idea that what you hold on to or it could be the stories you tell, it could be the objects you frame literally or figuratively, means something. And it changes the way that those stories or those objects live in the world and the people affiliated with them, how they see themselves, and I think that when she has, in her archival practice, she's younger than the generation of hip hop journalists, myself included, that she has been celebrating, but she just made us all see our work in a new way, and it's just been such a wonderful experience to see yourself through new eyes. And I think that's part of what storytelling can do. And then the question, of course, is where does it live or what is it for or whatever, but just the act of it, I think, is in itself really important. Thank you.
No, thank you. So I am sitting here, I'm thinking about something you said, Elizabeth, about it being an ecosystem, the storytelling ecosystem to be transformative. How do we do that when all the forces are against us and the model is not built for us? There's the constant hovering of the white gaze that tells us we should create our art, tell our stories, whatever form that may take, in certain ways. I'm reminded of, when we did our Future of Bookselling event, and we're like, yes, we need collectivism. How do you create a collective business model in capitalism? Like how, and be like successful, whatever that means. And so I just wonder, how do you make that? How do you do that? Where do you start?
Actually, the word successful really sets something in my brain. Because I feel like actually this is something that we talk about a lot in our community spaces here is rethinking that idea of successful. And I think it has to happen both, again, in these smaller spaces where, we are asking each other that question and asking ourselves that question. And then that also has to be happening on the systemic level. And I think in both of these ways, one is that, I do believe that we set people up to fail when we have predetermined markers of success. And when we're talking about, markets that traditional publishing, for example, hasn't fully understood, and how to reach those markets. And then, bringing in certain resources to try to target those markets, but not having the real freedom. See, again, that freedom is not having that real freedom to define how it is that you reach that market and what can happen once you do. Without that space, and we're just expecting books to hit bestseller lists the way that books before them have hit bestseller lists, right? I don't know that we're really making any change if we don't revisit that idea of what success can mean and how we can get to success for an individual project. And then I think also on the other side, it comes from within community in the first place, because again, we don't have that space to vision what success really could mean for an individual writer. And it's something that we talk about a lot, in writers who are at different points of their journey, and they're thinking about what path in publishing might be right for them. And I think, we always have this conversation about, well, every single person thinks that their only goal is to be, a #1 New York Times bestseller. And I just wonder, I truly wonder, and maybe someone will tell me that I'm naive, but couldn't it be possible that success is so much more if you have reached the audience who can truly hold you and see you? Isn't that something so much better than having spent so much time languishing, trying to reach just someone else, and who knows who that is?
Yeah, those are such great questions. I mean, I'm a writer, right? I have not. I mean, that's how I started my career, and that's actually my identity. But I've never been able to make a living as a writer. I pretty much have never been able to make a living as a writer. And if anybody has ever read my work, I'm a pretty good writer, but I could never do it, And that has not made me feel like less of a success, because, I just had different markers for it, and I still do. And maybe someday I'll publish a book, right? But maybe I won't. But I think ultimately the markers of success for me have always been quite different from that, And so much of what I said this, I did another panel a week or two ago, and what I always say to writers who are coming up, and I feel like this is the secret to my success as a writer, to whatever extent I've achieved it, is having a community of practice, a community of people that you are in regular conversation with, who understand what your goals are, who are working towards, let's say, complementary goals, even if they're not exactly the same, and who will kick you who will kick you if you're not pushing yourself, creatively. I think one of the real challenges for so many writers, particularly writers of color, anybody who is at odds in some way politically with what the dominant publishing industry is that you don't quite know, or sometimes, let me say, I don't know how true this is consistently, but sometimes you don't know where the edits you're getting are from somebody who is really editing you or editing their idea of you, like the contrast between those things. And I think that ensuring that you have people in your community, in your life, who have your back, who will ensure that you get the kind of feedback that you need to get in order to grow, is super important. So that's one point I would say. I don't know if that's useful. And then I think, again, like I said, I'm somebody who's never made a living as a writer. And I think that has made me very much less vulnerable as in the business, because I never felt like I needed that to be who I was, And I kind of recommend my approach in some ways. Like, I feel like if you want to be in the mainstream publishing industry, come in with as much protection as you can and define your own success on your own terms. But you have to understand you're working with companies that will define success on other terms, right? And that's just what it is. You have to understand that. And I think that, the big question is, like, for me as a young, well, maybe not a young, but a slightly young writer, I did a piece for Vibe magazine called Love Hurts, which was about gender-based violence in the hip hop industry. And for years after that piece ran in Vibe magazine, a piece for which I made like no money, comparatively little money, probably less than minimum wage, given the amount of work I put into it and the death threats I got for having written it. People came up to me for years afterwards and said to me, that piece saved my life. I don't need an award. I need people. I need to be able to reach people with what they need. the information they need, the storytelling, whatever the case may be. That's how I define success, you know? And I think, yeah, I think to me, one of the challenges now, which I think is really interesting and is part of the reason that we founded Critical Minded, is that a lot of the benchmarks that previously existed, like, oh, I'll get a review here, I'll get a review there, they don't exist anymore because so many of the publications that previously were able to run reviews are no longer doing so. And so what has been fascinating to observe as somebody who's newer to the publishing industry, I say I'm gray, but I'm green because I've only been in it for 2.5 years now, is that everybody's obsessed with the New York Times book review, right? Most people are not going to get a New York Times book review. And the thing is, the industry is obsessed with it, but so are the writers and people who you think, I mean, I would probably be obsessed with it too if I had a book coming out. But I think the big question you're asking is, does that serve you, right? Are those the markers that are ultimately going to be most useful to you? And one of the things, and I'll close here, that was most moving to me when I started in this gig was that we published a book called The Undocumented Americans. And we published it in the middle of the pandemic, and any events that would have happened were not able to happen. And then eventually we were able to do an event. And what was so powerful was the number of undocumented people or people who had some kind of experience with being undocumented who attended that event or wrote in about the book, wrote to Carla Cornejo Villavicencio, who's the writer. I was just like, this book, I mean, the things that they said about it, how important it was to them, I was like, that's it. It is doing what it needs to do in the world, And that, I think, I know that probably corporate didn't necessarily understand it in that way, but I think for our team and for the author, we were all clear that that was the success. That was the most important success that could happen. And in fact, she wanted to put their blurbs on the book. I don't think ultimately we were allowed to do that, but I think that was her desire and our desire as well.
I mean, now that you've mentioned Carla's book, I just that was the first book that I felt like my community was seeing. And never before had I seen a visible person of color who is brown like me say the things that she said in that prologue. That was, I am not writing the immigrant story that you want me to write, and I don't care what you think about it. And I had never seen anyone in my community with such a spotlight at a Big Five in this kind of arena say that, because you're always too afraid of the repercussion and you have to sort of strategically sidestep in these ways. And I mean, I cried, and I was grateful because I was a buyer at the time that my sales rep came to me and said, people are underestimating this book, but I know that this is for you and I want to make sure that you have this. And but how many people were able to find, and my rep was not Latinx, she's like, this is.
And what's incredible about that book, actually, I mean, it's like she's punk rock. I mean, I think one of the things she's just bad to the bone. And I think ultimately when I talk about medicinal versus magnetic, to me, obviously she's dealing with a big topic in capital letters, but she's dealing with it, and she's dealing with it seriously, but she's dealing with it with so much aesthetic boldness. And she's just she's a complete badass, right? And I think both because of what she says in the prologue and the fact that she's not writing for a white audience, but also because she refuses to be pigeonholed as an activist she's like, I am an artist and I'm going to write a lot of books about a lot of different things. And this one is the kind of the most obvious thing I would write about, but I'm going to write it in an extremely not obvious way. And that book, in fact, and this is one of the things that I think is important to say, has sold very well. It didn't sell very well at the beginning because it came out at the worst, one of the all-time worst possible times to come out. but it has sold. It has, I would say, one of my dreams for that book is, everything for that book. But I think it's something I really want to understand better, because I think that it has been a word of mouth success. It's been a slow burn. And one of the structural challenges, I think, in working for a big five company is that the tendency is to focus on the book. Like, speaking of, again, the metrics of success, how did it sell in the first 2 weeks? Did you get a Good Morning America thing? Did you get, were you on Fresh Air? Were you here? Were you there? And if all of those things don't happen within that 2-week period, they move on, because the whole system is set up in that way. And books like Carla's, of course, due to timing, but I think also just due to the nature of the book, it was a much more gradual process, but it has sold very well. And I always come back to it, because I'm like, never underestimate the audience at your peril,
I had actually kind of a follow-up question for you, Elizabeth, because I mean, I think it's something that people sort of come to me a lot with in this sort of sense of like, I think there's like maybe it's a lack of trust, or it's a lack of vision, or a lack of patience, or some combination of all of those things. But to watch, I think, for me, at least in creating programming around here, one of the things that I just sort of approach it with is, it takes a long time sometimes for people to understand what it is that we're doing and what we're creating here. It's not always obvious to people, but if we do the work the way that we know that the work needs to be done, we always get to the right place that we need to be. And I kind of wonder, it sounds to me a little bit like maybe your approach with acquisitions and your approach in publishing is maybe a little bit of that. Am I hearing that correctly?
I would say probably a combination of things. Like, I think that, so to be clear, The Undocumented Americans is not one of my books. When I came in, it was already published, so I can take no responsibility for it, but I have a lot of love and admiration for it. I think, to be transparent, I think it's a mix, right? Because I came into this role, I'm vice president and executive editor. When I came in, I was told I was the most senior Latina, not just at PRH where I work, but in all of the big five, right? So you come in and you have a lot on your shoulders, and you're also, in an apprentice-based industry, and you're coming in as somebody who has never worked in it before, and all of the things that I just said. And so what that means is that I'm kind of trying to strike a balance, which means I need to sell some books. Like, the first book I acquired was Adam Serwer's The Cruelty is the Point. Adam is a dear old friend of mine. And it was kind of serendipitous that it just kind of, it came in the week I was starting. My boss, Chris, was like, "Are you interested?" I was like, "Hell yeah, I love Adam, great." And it was also just structurally, to be transparent again, a kind of editorial work that I'd done a bunch as a magazine editor. So it was a collection of essays so I started with that. So, it's stuff like that. It's like, I'm not in a position to remake the industry today or tomorrow by myself, right? So I'm trying to take a combination of calculated risks and then also invest in some kind of higher chance projects that I really believe in a lot of cases, writers who I've known for a long time. So that's been helpful. But one of the things that I've done, and I don't know if this relates to what you're asking, but in my experience, there have been relatively few Latinx proposals coming in. There are very, very few Latinx agents. And so, of course, that's enraging and ridiculous. And so part of what I've been doing is trying to help people, talented, wonderful, smart people come up with proposals and work with them to develop into books. So one of the ones like that I'm working on is Guadalupe Rosales' book. She is and actually when you were asking the question earlier, I think Michelle, you were asking the question about how can we, in an ecosystem that is so stacked against us, how can we create the things or be creative? And I think of her, like with Veteranas and Rucas, she used Instagram, and she's like, I'm going to create a community archive for LA women of my generation to tell their stories and look fly as, like this is what it is. And she's been incredibly, not just, it's splendid, right? But also she's built a huge community around that process. And so that was one of the first acquisitions I made, was working with her. But it took a long time to get that a proposal developed, and then help her find an agent, and then bring it in. So I guess those projects have been really me trying to articulate a set of, I guess, PowerPoints, or like to make these individuals legible to an industry that doesn't see them, and then bring them in, So that's certainly a percentage of what I do. And again, I'm not sure if it's exactly getting at your question, but it is really hard. And one of the things that's really hard about being in this role is like the level of scrutiny that you take, and the possibility that, if you don't sell, if I don't hit the metrics that my corporation needs from me, I'm not going to be around here very long.
But that is a kind of investment too. I mean, like, this is a different way. And I think that that's kind of part of how we have to function in this role, is that we're always having to be kind of creative with the resources that we can bring together. And so in a way, kind of being able to build proposals for people who weren't building them themselves is like this recapturing of a resource, right? Because you're already there and you have that space in that room. And I think, to me, that's one of the most frustrating parts about the way that we have to do our work, is that we have to build kind of the resource itself from scratch, and then use it. And thank you for sharing, though, because I do think that that's like, I feel like that's a lot of how we move forward, is that we kind of have to recognize, to some degree, at least within our communities, that that's a bit of our work along the way, is that where there seems to be nothing, we gotta like just put something there and see how we can. I do think, I'm asked a lot of times these questions about like moving forward, and I do think that and as Michelle was kind of saying, like the amount of energy that we put into reforms for something that will never be reformed into a shape that will actually properly hold us. But at the same time, there are a lot of resources held up in that place that needs reform. And so to me, I think that parallel movement has to be part of how we invest, is that that new vision has to be being created alongside the ways in which that space can take that vision and build in pieces of it to move itself forward too.
No, thank you. That, I think what's really struck me, and I think is when you're talking, Elizabeth, about how you have to sort of help these artists, and I've seen more editors are being transparent about how they like find these writers who have like no access, or who don't have an agent or anything like that, and they're like, here's what you need to do. I'm going to help you, connect you with some people so we can bring your work, to the communities that need it. But is then making that work legible to the powers that be. And there's this footwork that happens that I don't ever really know if you ever get comfortable with that footwork, if it ever does not get tiring, if it gets easier. I think in being with the Word, I have finally found a space where I don't have to do footwork. That is both liberating, but also I'm like, what do I do with myself? Like, I don't have to, I'm like, what?
Where do I get my exercise?
Yeah. So how does that for you, though? We mentioned it in the green room, so I'll go ahead and just bring it up. The PEN America published the study about race and equity in the publishing industry, which is like non-existent, and with all of the fervor of 2020, with all the talk, and like, where are we really? You still have to translate yourself and the artists you work with, and like, what is that? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say this, like if I had started in publishing when I started my career at Vibe magazine when I was 23 or 24. And the really important experience I had, and I think it's worth saying in this context, is that I learned early and often that white institutions did not have a monopoly on excellence. And that, it just like, there was a literary, it wasn't literary. It wasn't literary because I see literary for me as like exclusionary, just because that's been my experience. But it was just like people who write good, like people who write really well and who are extraordinary writers, extraordinary thinkers in community. And I will be clear, there were plenty of messed up things there too, right, that I had to navigate. So that's very important to acknowledge. But I think that fundamental idea that I don't have this like wistful thing of, oh, if the people of color ran everything. I've worked in a lot of institutions that were led by people of color. They were not perfect, right? The set of problems was different. And I think I prefer those problems to these problems, but I'm not super duper nostalgic about them. I think, like I said, I wouldn't have stayed around in the industry long enough to get to where I am now. But I think part of what I see my role as, and it's very important to say this, I've shared with you all some of the mechanics and the challenges of this role, but I should also be very, very clear that I am in perhaps one of the best positions I could possibly be in the sense that I work with an extraordinary team that I respect so much. And it is like all POC from, it is a very, very unusual space in publishing, right? So it doesn't mean that we don't interact with the broader corporate context, and doesn't mean I don't have to make my case to people who don't share my values or experience, but it means that I have a cocoon around me, which is really freeing. And I guess the way I see it as somebody who, I worked in philanthropy for 10 years. The first philanthropy I worked in was Black-led, and the Ford Foundation. And it was a fiasco in many ways, right? And then I worked for white-led philanthropies, which were also, there were lots of issues. I guess I'm used to the fact that when people get together and move money, they usually make a lot of mistakes, right? And I think and there's a lot of entrenched dynamics that get reinforced and how do you say, kind of repackaged and reconfigured, but ultimately it's the same thing. And I think my responsibility in publishing, getting into this role at this stage in my career, is to be bold and to be courageous. So it's hard. It's not always my favorite thing to do, but it also feels like my responsibility because I'm very clear that people in more junior positions can't do that or have a very, very hard time doing that. In my short career in publishing, I've heard from many of those people, and they've shared with me experiences that, I feel deeply troubled by and I feel responsible to. So I guess I've moved a lot of money, I know how to dance. I dance well. And I think that it's that balance between getting the resources to where they need to go and standing up strategically and consistently so that the challenges that need to happen. And I don't know, I think the PEN America report, I'm happy to talk in more detail about it, but I think to me, it unearths a whole series of dynamics, which I think you all probably know better than I do. I think there's a lot of important stuff in there. One of the huge challenges I think about that report is that it relies primarily on people of color to explain a white industry, and it puts those people at risk in an industry that is in many cases hostile to them. And so that particular type of labor, I entered into it with my eyes open, but it definitely gives me pause, like who should be answering for these numbers? I don't think it's the people who didn't create them. I think it's the people who actually benefit from them and who design them, you know. So that's a whole lot. I hope there's something there that's helpful, but I guess, you know, I feel like there's so much, there's actually a lot that you can achieve in these industries, even if you don't achieve total transformation of them. And I think my boss, Chris Jackson, is such an enormous example of that. Like Ta-Nehisi's work, the fact that, you know, the fact that that is out there in the world and became a bestseller and everything, to me, that's huge, you know? And so doesn't mean that everything else isn't true, because of course it is. But I'm always interested in like what's possible in these spaces and to what degree do we want to spend time in them, and at what point do we want to move on, you know? And I'll just say that one of the things that I've heard, I did a panel with Latinx editors a couple weeks ago, which was so,
yes, I did. I saw it.
Oh, thank you. That was really one of my, it was such a beautiful thing. And one of the questions that I had asked was, you know, what's our lineage? Like, who are we? And what I heard from the other editors who have been in the business longer than I have, they were like, we are it. Like, this is the largest critical mass of Latinx editors that has ever happened. I don't know if that's true, but if it is, we're talking less than 10 people representing 62 million in an industry that controls the vast majority of the books that get published in this world, in this country. That is extremely alarming, but it's also full of possibilities, you know? And I guess I choose to see the possibilities.
Oh, thank you for that. I saw that, and your little very short one line about burnout was like, did everything for me, actually. We'll just note that.
My line was, I've done it before and I'm not going to do it for this corporation.
Yes, it just unleashed something in my soul. I actually chatted it to Viniyanka as soon as I was like, she said this, and I loved it.
Then Michelle knew, like, this is the manifesto now. But I do think, like, to that, you know, kind of bigger picture too of, I mean, it is really, I think it's important to name that the work that we do is really hard and exhausting. And like, you know, I'm not gonna like lie to anyone in this room. I started the word from nothing, and it's been a beautiful journey, but also exhausting. And, you know, I am depleted, you know, 6 years into that work, I am depleted. And I don't think that we should ignore that reality and ignore the fact that when we are doing such hard uphill work and creating things that didn't exist before, because that is the work that's put on us, because those resources are not there. I think part of the way that we make sure that this work stays, you know, that it can thrive is to not tie it to ourselves. And so I think that that's one of the spaces that I wonder about how well publishing really is setting anyone up to do that, because, you know, here I get to have full control over how we manage that. I've gotten to be the source of making sure that this work doesn't get too tied to me. But, you know, in the case of a new imprint that's given a lot of resources and support in a very certain, you know, space and tied to a very certain person, that's too much. That isn't a recipe for making sure that we're doing this work in a way that will pass it on and will allow it to grow and will allow it to give voice to many people who, I mean, it just doesn't allow, that's not the seed of it. And I think then on the other side of it, while we don't necessarily have control over how, you know, publishing will continue down that path, I do think that it's important for us all to talk about and name that that's not the practice. That's not the way that we move forward. And we need to kind of give ourselves permission to, you know, I'm very, very grateful to my organization. Like you were saying, Elizabeth, I have this beautiful cocoon here, and I'm very grateful that I get to come to them and say, y'all, I'm exhausted. And their response is not, to say, you don't get to be exhausted. There's so much more work left. Their response is to say, how can we make sure that you get some time, and how can we lift, how can we take the rest of that lift for now, forever, and that's a question that I guess maybe we do have the burden of kind of asking, because nobody's asking it for us. But I wonder if there's a way that, at least if we can have that conversation, then maybe the people who are being given those initial resources can start to build it into their practice too.
And the question is sustainability for?
I think the question is, how is the work, what are we doing in a way that can, I guess this is how I see the word. We can't change everything. We can't be everywhere. We're just this one small thing. But what I hope that we do is that we kind of are a little bit of a spark, so that people in our community can build their own light even when we're not there. And I think that's true of our programming. I hope that's true also of my leadership here in this organization. I hope that what I am doing is that everyone around me is taking a little bit of whatever I have learned over all of these many wild years, and is able to, even when I'm not there, they can shine. And I guess that's the question, is are we setting up a system in which what we are creating is not something that we're holding ourselves, but that we're giving little bits and pieces of it to everyone who can hold it and keep it running much further than we can.
Yeah, I think that's such an important question. And that one place where I thought a lot about that in philanthropy, and I am critical minded in some ways. The fact that it exists without me, and I'm still involved, but there's an executive director who has his own ideas, who does his own stuff. That is like one of the huge gifts of my life, is to be able to articulate a set of ideas that I think are really important, and also let go of them, And I think one thing I would just say, encourage you and encourage anyone, including myself, when you're leading, be careful to lead in a healthy way. Be careful to take the time you need, and be careful not to get exhausted. Because when you lead in an exhausted way, you're normalizing those behaviors within your organization. And I think that's something that is so prevalent in publishing. It's so normalized in publishing. It's so heartbreaking. So there's that. And then I guess I would say, in terms of, I think organizations like yours are so important, because, as you said, they can represent a spark. They can represent a space where a set of possibilities can be practiced, a set of ideas can be played with. And I think that's incredibly important. I think, and I'll just say, like, as somebody who right now is working for a corporation, I don't expect a whole lot of corporation. A corporation is market driven. Like, I think that it's so funny, because a lot of the DEI conversations, and this is one of my problems with the Pan American Report actually, is that they talk about it as if it were a moral imperative. And I'm like, this is not a moral industry. This is a market-driven industry. I hope it's like somewhat, but that's not the inherent driver or logic of it. And they talk about diversity or whatever they're talking about, however they frame it, as like, again, as a medicine, or as an obligation, or as these days, and I'm like, this is ridiculous. It's not that. That's not, when you talk about it that way and you continually frame it in that way, you position it as something that people don't need to do. They should feel somehow obligated to do, or feel embarrassed if they don't do it. And I feel like all of those emotions are the wrong emotions for a business. I don't think that's the way people should relate to markets that they have completely ignored. Am I a capitalist? No, but I can talk capitalist language. And I understand that, for example, the Latinx market is 62 million people who are completely ignored by this industry. There's an archival, there are all kinds of cases for why that needs to change. But to me, talk their language, like, I'm not trying to whine to be taken care of. That's not how I see it. I really see it as like, I see it as a fundamental misuse of capital. And so anyway, just saying that because I that was something that really kind of struck me in the Pen America thing. I was like, as long as we're positioned in this way, we don't get taken seriously. And particularly when times are hard, we are going to be the first thing that goes.
Well, and it's completely, I mean, it's never going to, as you're saying, it's never going to actually have an impact or translate. And the truth is that it's not just, I mean, yes, it is a moral imperative, and that's an absolute truth. But the reality is that it's just bad business. It's truly just bad business. There's
Exactly.
so many people who could be reached, and it's a lack of to go in the same direction always and hope that you haven't overspent that. That's not a way that I don't think any person in the business world would, if you presented it to them in that way, I don't think that they would think that that's how they want to run their business, or that's how their business could be dynamic and thriving in the long run. And those things are both truths. We want people to be treated as human beings within that industry, because everyone is a human being within that industry.
Yeah.
But also at the same time understand that we're all actually fighting for the reality that there are people who want books and you're creating books for them, and you have to know who those people are, and you have to actually find a way to make those books for them. That's, at the end of the day, what we're doing.
That's what and I think, you know, of course, like there's a not-for-profit component. And of course, obviously, I believe that it is morally right to create a more representative industry. But I just think that in when we lead with that, we're actually marginalizing ourselves again, because that's not the way that they talk about this stuff. You know, that's not the way they think about things. And I think it's just been so interesting, because I'm like, this is an industry that, because of so many elitist dynamics, it operates in ways that just don't make don't make financial sense. But that because people have these relationships, and this is who you hang out with, and that's so much about like the agent dynamic. Like this particular agent, that agent always gets, you know, 7 figures for an acquisition, and you're like, but wait, did you read the book? Like, did you read the proposal? Oh, but it's just like all about kind of prestige and pedigree and all that stuff. And I'm like, can we just, if we're going to be a market-oriented industry, can we actually just take a cold, hard look at the cold, hard cash here, you know? Anyway, I will get off my high horse on this one, but it's just something that I'm just like, I don't understand how you can not serve, like there's all of these markets that you're ignoring, and you're telling me you're doing business, you know?
Yeah, and I think, I know we have to wrap up soon, but there's something that you said, Elizabeth, about specifically that report that is really important and kind of touches on something, you know, we talk about at the Word often, and that we've experienced, is the fact that so many BIPOC did the heavy lifting in that report, and that are responsible for actually reporting on the the state of publishing. And, you know, I think you said something earlier before this event, Viniyanka, just about how we approach people and how we work together with people. And, you know, when you are a BIPOC-led organization, people come to you a lot. You know, it looks good, and they want you to do all this work or give them information that apparently you have, you know what I mean? Certain information, it's like, yes, we're doing this work, but also we are not the be all and end all, right, of a community. And to really think about how we approach people when we're asking them something. And Viniyanka, if you just, you know, you said something earlier, and I feel like it'll just be easier.
I think I know what you're referring to. It's been such a wonderful month, Margins Bookselling Month. Thank you for celebrating it with us, Elizabeth. But one of the things I think, that it really kind of brings out is it's been so interesting to see who kind of comes to these workshops, and we're asking these questions that we think really need to be asked. And we have, we're giving this platform to people who know how to do this work, who knew how to do it yesterday, and it'll be really interesting to me to see tomorrow who gets funded to do that work, who gets trusted to do that work, because there is definitely a disconnect there. And I think that's something that I think it's something that should be more visible. I think it's something that we should talk about. Why is it that the people who pointed out the issues in the industry will not be the people empowered to make change, even though we're looking to them as the people who know what the problems are and who know what the solutions are? But those will not be the people who we trust to then know how to move forward.
Yeah, man. It's a really, so first of all, I'll just say I did not spend our time together ranting about philanthropy, but I'll just say one thing, which is that philanthropy exists as a result of public largesse. Like money, those endowments are shielded from taxation because they're supposed to be used in the public interest, but there's no public accountability for that. And I will spend, like, anytime anybody wants to talk to me about that, I will say it on the record. It is, in my opinion, completely problematic and should be changed. There should be public oversight for all philanthropic decisions. So I don't know if that relates a little bit to what you're talking about. But yeah, I think in terms of the questions like raised, again, I think the PEN America report is so important. And I think, I had the good fortune when I was working in philanthropy to eavesdrop on organizers and learn about organizing, both in kind of political context and to a certain extent in cultural context. And one of the things that has been so, I'll just say heartbreaking about this world is that there is not organizing to the extent that I believe that there needs to be. Obviously, there are some great groups that are doing elements of organizing, but you need real serious infrastructure to build power. And you need expertise and you need time and all of that stuff. And so one of the things that I think is missing, like the PEN report reveals a whole lot of stuff. And as you say, it relies on the people who experience the inequality versus the people who are the perpetrators of it, which is, again, in my opinion, very problematic and also very common, right? But there isn't the connective tissue, I think, between that and the industry, which is organizing and power building. Because you can have the information, but to activate that information in a way that protects the people who said the thing, people like all the folks who are in there, that's long-term investment. And I'll just say, like, for me, one of the things that I've tried to do in my work as a funder, as a journalist, and all the capacities that I've worked, is to advocate for the idea that contesting culture is necessary if we want to transform storytelling dynamics. And when I say contesting, what I mean is organizing to challenge whatever institution it is and to build power. I don't think, what do they say? Power does not concede without pressure. Somebody said it more eloquently than I just did, but I think that that's a huge part of this that is missing. And I've experienced it multiple times in the past couple of years. When something like this happens, you actually need to protect the people who speak out. And we don't have a mechanism to do that right now. And I don't think it's not that there isn't anything that we can do in these conditions, but I would just identify that as a very clear issue. And I think organizations like yours are part of that connective tissue, but we need more, and we need it to be, I think, more systematic.
And I think an important part of that conversation too, just to add to what you are saying, Elizabeth, is that I think also, in the system as a whole, in the publishing industry as a whole, I think it's important to hold the truth that, criticism is an act of love, right? I mean, it's not that when you're criticizing the current limitations, that's an act of destruction. What it is, it's an act of reconstruction, because we will not move forward. It will implode in and of itself if it cannot see its own limitations. And we don't put our energy into places that we don't care about. We put our energy there because we want to see it be better. And so I hope that one of the things that happens in that organizing is that people really embrace it, because it is what will move us all forward together.
100%. My mind is exploding. Thank you both so much. I think this conversation could go for like another hour, basically. And I thank you, Elizabeth, for all the work you do and for joining us tonight and being a part of our Margins book selling celebration. Viniyanka, I mean, there are no words for my gratitude and love for you and for this organization. I do have to give a shout out because my Margins bookstore, Palabras, was watching tonight. My safe space, the space I wish I had when I was growing up here in Phoenix. So thank you for all you do and for tuning in tonight. I had to do that. Just kind of fangirled a little bit over my space. This is recorded. We will send out a link so you can watch it again. I know I will be watching again. I took so many notes, and it has definitely, it will sit with me for a long time. Stay tuned. Make sure you sign up for our newsletter on all of our other events. We will be starting our annual fundraiser in terms of talking about investing in storytelling. Hello. Thank you. You will be hearing a lot from us. And if you enjoyed this, of course, Jawa, if you enjoyed this event, then definitely stay tuned at what we have in store for you during our fundraiser. It's exciting. Elizabeth, Viniyanka, thank you both. Goodbye, everyone. And thank you so much again for everything.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.